Hey guys, so in this video, I want to take a few minutes to walk through a perspective on trade deficits and tariffs that I think isn't getting enough attention right now. You'll hear a lot of debate about whether tariffs are good or bad, but I think the real issue is actually a lot deeper, and it's about what kind of economy we're building and who it actually benefits. So in this video, I want to talk through four main points. So first, why are these tariffs being imposed? What's the problem that we're trying to deal with? What are the pros and cons of trade deficits? How have tariffs impacted our labor force? And what my prediction for the future is. So, what is the problem? Why are we doing this in the first place? So, the US has had a long running trade deficit. That just means that we import more stuff than we export, and we consume more than we produce. It's pretty easy to miss how weird this is. Like, how can we afford to keep importing more than we export year after year? And the answer actually is that we export dollars as well. So we send money overseas, and in return we get goods. And this these excess dollars that we send overseas fund this imbalance between the goods and services imported versus the goods and services exported. But the thing is that that money doesn't just disappear. It doesn't just kind of vanish into thin air. It gets used, and it ends up buying stuff, and what it buys is pretty important. So how is this excess trade money used? Typically, these dollars come back. They get recycled into the US through foreign purchases of our assets. That could be stocks, bonds, and real estate, or could be central banks holding dollars as part of their reserves. That's foreign central banks. But really, the point is that we're making a trade-off here. We get cheap stuff now, and foreigners get long-term claims on U.S. value. So, with these last 40 years of persistent trade deficits, how much of our assets do foreigners now own? Really, the numbers speak for themselves. So, according to the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department, in 2023, foreigners owned nearly $27 trillion of US securities. And for securities, think like stocks and bonds. The ownership by percentage of by U.S. residents continued a long-term downward trend. So think of it as the percentage ownership by foreigners has increased over all these years that we're running trade deficits, and the ownership percentage by U.S. residents has decreased in the same time period. Foreign investors now own 20% of US securities. Broken down by asset type, that's 33% for US Treasuries, so our government's debt, 27% for corporate debt, and 17% for equities. Remember that our total net worth is about $124 trillion. So 27 trillion in securities plus real estate and other ownership assets that foreigners have in our country is definitely not a trivial amount. So we've allowed foreigners to amass quite a large ownership stake in U.S. assets. It also shouldn't surprise anyone that three of the countries that we have large trade deficits with are also our biggest real estate buyers, and that's China, Canada, and Mexico. And in fact, when we had a housing bubble, a real estate bubble in the 2000s, a lot of that was fueled by foreign purchases of US real estates and foreign purchases of our bonds, which drove down interest rates. So these two things together played a part in inflating our real estate bubble that ended up causing a big financial crisis in 2007 to 2009. So I call this a vicious cycle of dollar recycling. So here's the cycle is we buy goods which sends our dollars overseas. Those dollars then get exchanged for local currencies in foreign markets and wind up in the hands of foreign financial institutions. Those foreign financial institutions ultimately use the dollars to buy US assets. So those dollars come back into our country. Who do they usually buy U.S. assets from? So they usually buy them from U.S. residents, U.S. citizens who own the assets. So the U.S. citizen sells the asset to a foreign investor. That means the U.S. citizen now has cash to spend, and the foreign investor owns the asset. And what do we spend that cash on? We spend it to buy more goods usually. So we spend a good chunk of it on buying foreign imports, and that starts the cycle all over again. So we keep sending dollars out the door. Those dollars come back, buy up our assets, and give us more cash to spend to buy more imports, which then ends up with more foreign ownership of assets. So the cycle just repeats, and we consume beyond our means and pay for it by selling future claims on U.S. output. So I think in evaluating trade deficits, it's important to understand both sides of the argument. And I think Milton Friedman makes a strong case for the positive benefits of trade deficits. So I want to let him explain this to you guys.
This carries over to the terminology we use. I've already referred to the misleading terminology of protection. But when people talk about a favorable balance of trade, what is that term taken to mean? It's taken to mean that we export more than we import. But from the point of view of our well-being, that's an unfavorable balance. That means we're sending out more goods and getting fewer in. Each of you in your private household would know better than that. You don't regard it as a favorable balance when you have to send out more goods to get less coming in. It's favorable when you can get more by sending out less.
Okay, so think about the argument that Milton Friedman is making here. So he's saying it's pretty obvious that if we're able to consume more than we produce, then we're getting the greater benefit of this deal. So we're doing well if we're consuming more than we're producing, because that raises our standard of living for a lesser cost than we have to pay for it, right? So trade deficits let us consume more than we produce. But I think this argument only works and only makes sense if we're talking about occasional or temporary trade deficits. When it becomes structural, when it lasts for decades, then we're really not just trading paper for goods. We're trading control of productive assets for short-term consumerism. So we're really front-loading the benefits and back-loading the costs. We're getting consumption now and doing so by mortgaging the ownership stake that future generations have in the U.S. economy. So Warren Buffett gives what I think is a really good analogy to understand this concept, this idea of mortgaging our assets. I want to let him explain this one.
Incredibly rich family that owns, we'll say metaphorically, millions of acres of land. They can't see, they can't travel to the outer reaches of their domain, but nevertheless, they sit on the front porch and wait for the produce to come in from this vast holding, and when they get it all, they still want to consume about 6% more than everything that's been produced on the farm. And they have the ability to do that by simply selling off a little piece of the farm every day and every year that they can't even see. So they don't feel any poor at the end of the day or at the end of the year, because it's still, as far as their eyesight can see, they own everything that God ever created. And they can sell that little piece, or they can mortgage it. They can send IOUs to these people that are giving them the extra goods to consume. And we are a very, very, very rich family, and we produce a whole lot, and we consume a little bit more than we produce. And we trade away a little bit of the farm, or put a little bit of a mortgage on every day, and the rest of the world is happy to take a little piece of our farm or take a mortgage on it. A little harder to send us something so that we can consume a little bit more than we produce. It's been going on a while. It's accelerated a lot in the last few years, and more the rest of the world is owning part of us, and we are going to have to service that ownership either through interest if they took it in IOUs or in some other way. And it can go on a long time, but if it goes on a long time, the world will own a good bit of us, and our children will be paying one way or another for the fact that we got to consume more than we produced. And it could happen. You've obviously had some less interest in the rest of the world accepting dollars by the fact that the dollar's declined somewhat in value in the last few years. In other words, interest in the rest of the world.
Okay, so I think that's a really great analogy because it shows that we can fund excess consumption by selling off a bit of our assets each year. But when we do this for decades, then a little bit of the farm accumulates into a large percentage of the farm, right? So it doesn't feel like we're sacrificing that much each year that we're doing it, but these small effects add up to a large effect when we're talking about a policy that's in place for 40 years. So what is the bargain that we get from the current trade system? For the last 30 years, we got cheap TVs, cheap clothes, higher GDP, and we paid for it by selling our assets and hollowing out our productive capacity. The people who used to make things now do paperwork, compliance, or service jobs that aren't really building anything. Homes and land and other assets became more expensive, while wages for actual producers stagnated. People got priced out of prosperity. So I think when we take a bird's eye view here and look at this deal over the long term, I think it's really a big problem. I don't think in the end we end up winning from this sort of system. Although in the short term, it lets us live beyond our means. So was Milton Friedman wrong? I would say not exactly, because we do need some trade deficit to, first of all, to keep the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Second of all, when Milton Friedman was making these points, it was the early 1980s when we weren't running perpetual trade deficits for decades. In the 70s, we even had a trade surplus. In the early 80s, our largest trade deficits were only around 1% of GDP, whereas in the 2000s, they got around 6% of GDP, and now they're around 4% of GDP. So I think you have to take what Milton Friedman says in the context of the time. At that time, running a trade deficit wasn't really a problem because it helped keep the dollar the reserve currency and let us consume a little bit beyond our means, but without a huge cost. For me, the problem is we never really asked what the right amount of trade deficit is and what is sustainable. The problem isn't trade in general. In fact, trade is really good for everyone. But it's the size and duration of trade imbalances. So for 40 years, we've had growing trade deficits, and now the time comes where we have to reevaluate the cost-benefit equation and whether we want to keep allowing foreign investors to accumulate more and more of our productive assets. So for me, the bottom line, the way we should think about the economy is that prosperity comes from building and making things, from producing things that actually improve our lives, not just shifting money around and managing one another. We need some of that, but I think we've moved too far in that direction. These trade deficits let us live beyond our means and let us do jobs that are not necessarily productive, but as we've established, it comes at a cost. If most of our workforce is in roles that don't actually produce value, then we're in trouble no matter what the GDP and the economic metrics say. So the anthropologist David Graeber identified this phenomenon in modern society, which he called bullshit jobs, and he wrote a whole book on this. And he says there are all these jobs where people doing them can't even justify their existence. So uh, not only do we have a problem where people aren't doing productive work, but it also creates a crisis of meaning, because if you don't feel like your job is important or socially valuable, then uh, you can't really gain satisfaction from it. And this is not just about bureaucracy and wasteful government agencies. It's also in the private sector. It's marketing fluff. It's excessive litigation, endless compliance lawyers. And then David Graeber identifies these 5 categories that I don't agree with completely, but I think there's a real kernel of important truth in this idea that outsourcing production has really led to this influx and growth in these sort of unproductive jobs. So I want to show you a visual metaphor that I think really helps explain what's happened to our economy in the last 40 years. So imagine the productive economy, the people building, manufacturing, transporting, growing. Imagine that as a large central gear of the system. This is the gear that moves everything else, and it's what creates real wealth and well-being. Around that gear, you have 5 smaller gears. I call them bureaucracy and regulation, advertising and marketing, middlemen, litigation and redistribution, and administration. And of course, there are other gears as well, but I just wanted to identify these 5 as 5 major categories that are sort of meant to help the real economy function well. These smaller gears should exist. I'm not arguing for zero regulation, zero marketing, or no legal system. So they are important. But what we have to understand is they only make sense in the service of the productive gear. They're supposed to help things run smoothly, not replace the work of production. For me, the problem is we've outsourced so much of the hard work, the core of the productive economy, that these smaller gears have kind of started to spin on their own. Rather than their purpose being to help the larger gear spin, their purpose becomes more to spin themselves faster. So they've become overgrown, and in some cases, they've even started to create friction rather than support. When the main gear slows down, and when we stop building and making things ourselves, we really create a vacuum. And into that vacuum floods administrative, legal, compliance, marketing jobs, work that kind of feels disconnected from real value creation, real production of goods and services that make our lives better. So the system keeps turning, but the smaller gears start to turn for their own sake rather than for support of the larger gear. We get a lot of motion, but not so much progress, and fewer people doing work that builds prosperity, and more people who are managing, regulating, and litigating each other. And that's part of why the economy can look really good, can grow in terms of GDP, even while people feel less secure and less fulfilled and less hopeful. So I view this as a misallocation of labor, and I see this misallocation of labor as enabled by the kind of trade policies that we've had for the last few decades. The problem is this misallocation of labor really costs us. We lose the ability to build homes affordably, to fix infrastructure, to make goods domestically. And I want to give you a few examples of the costs that we bear as a result of these, um, what I call unproductive jobs. So the average US citizen pays a tort tax of $1,561 annually due to frivolous lawsuits. When you start accounting for dynamic effects, the effects of frivolous lawsuits cost us about 4.8 million jobs per year. Then we have regulatory compliance costs average $12,800 per employee. But that figure balloons to $50,100 in smaller manufacturing companies, which makes market access as a small manufacturing firm prohibitively expensive. Then costs, bureaucratic excess ends up costing us about 3 trillion per year. And then, of course, we pay more to middlemen than ever before, like insurance companies, e-commerce guys. So the middlemen industry is sucking up a larger percentage of our income than it ever has. So in effect, we're becoming a service economy that only exists to service and manage things rather than produce things. You want services to number one, make our lives better and uh, help the productive economy function more smoothly, but we're getting services for services' sake and uh, lawsuits to make lawyers rich. But these things have kind of gotten too large to serve their purpose, in my view. So the fundamental question is really, how do we fix this problem? And are tariffs the best way to fix it? I think that they're probably not. So, number one, in my view, Americans may be too locked into this current system and it might take a longer period of transition to get back to being a net producer again. It's also a risky strategy if the dollar loses its reserve currency status as a result of a global trade war, then that'll cost us more than it benefits us. So I think this is a high risk and low reward strategy. And there are better things that we can do, especially in the short term, to help fix these imbalances. And it's not just all foreigners that are to blame. We have to look at our own economy, our own policies, and how they've inhibited production, manufacturing, and building. And I think that's kind of the low-hanging fruit that we can address first. So, have trade deficits been too large for too long? I think that's pretty much undoubtedly true. So, this is a real problem, which I think the Trump administration is correctly diagnosing. The problem I have is the treatment plan. So, I'm not sure the treatment is the best medicine for the problem. So, I want to propose a different treatment, maybe a better medicine. Rather than using tariffs, which are a blunt tool and can cause more harm than good, we should try the low-hanging fruit first. Let's cut red tape, let's deregulate intelligently, and let's reform our litigation culture. If we're being honest, I think we can say that the United States has become overly litigious and that lawsuits are not serving the purpose of just redressing wrongs that occur in the system, but they've kind of taken on a life of their own, and there's exploitation by the legal industry of the number of laws and regulations that are on the books. So where do we see this all going? The thing is, it's in everyone's interest to negotiate and to come to free trade agreements. So I think that's the most likely direction. If it benefits everyone, then I think there's a good chance of it happening. I could see, because of the competition between the United States and China, as kind of a emerging hegemonic battle, that could persist a bit longer, in my view. But I think with the rest of the world, everyone has a clear incentive to not start trade wars and to come to agreements that are good for both sides. At the end of the day, it's really in everyone's interest to rebalance rather than to burn bridges. All right, guys, that's all for this video. I hope you liked it. If you'd like to see more of this kind of stuff, then subscribe to the channel. I'll be making more videos on economics and investing in the near future.